Welcome to the ANEW Body Insight Podcast, empowering and inspiring your journey to optimal health. Hosted by Dr. Supatra Tovar, clinical psychologist, registered dietitian, fitness expert, and author of Deprogrammed Diet Culture. Rethink your relationship with food, heal your mind, and live a diet-free life. And Chantal Donnelly, physical therapist and author of Settled, How to Find Calm in a Stress-Inducing World. We follow our guests' journey to optimal health, providing you with the keys to unlock your own wellness path. Tune in and evolve with us. Welcome back to the ANEW Body Insight Podcast. We are back for the second half of our interview with author of Brain Over Binge, Kathryn Hansen. Kathryn gave us some invaluable insight into her journey to recovery and writing Brain Over Binge. I cannot wait to pick her brain some more. Thanks for coming back, Kathryn.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Wonderful. Many people believe, and you were also told, that you have to avoid trigger foods to recover from binge eating. I stand with you on this. But what is your stance on food restriction, and how does it fit into your recovery philosophy?
Yeah, that's definitely a big question and something I work with people on all the time. My basic premise is that no food can trigger a binge. It can only trigger an urge. And as I talked about in the first half, the urges are the direct cause of binging. So when you eat a food, you have an urge. The urge is what causes the binge if you act on it, not the food. Now, that being said, some foods are more likely to create a response in our brain that makes us want to keep eating more. It's just those highly stimulating foods, all the modern foods we have available. And that is something that doesn't go away even after recovery. Sure, you're not going to have the desire to eat massive amounts of it, as in binging, but certain foods are more stimulating and can make you crave more. So the reality is, some foods are more quote unquote triggering than others as far as heightening our cravings and making us want more. Now, the decision of how to eat these triggering foods in someone recovering from binging is a very individual thing. And I think it's important. I teach people to try to eat in the least restrictive way that's possible for them, which means to incorporate as many foods as they can. Now, some people don't feel like they're quite ready for certain foods because they do create such a response physiologically in their body and brain. And I always tell people it's okay if you want to put foods aside for a while. Like, that's okay as long as you're getting abundant nutrition overall, as long as you're eating enough, as long as you're having other enjoyable foods in your life. Like, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong if you decide to put a triggering food aside for a time. There's a lot of different philosophies in the eating disorder world. I mean, there's two main ones. One is that you have to learn to eat all foods in moderation. You can't restrict anything ever in order to recover. Another philosophy is you have to avoid all trigger foods in order to recover. So it becomes very confusing for the in recovery. And I remember trying both methods and being very confused. But my basic premise is that it is an individual thing, but that I do think it's very valuable to learn to eat as many foods as possible in moderation to break the connection between those foods and binging, because it does become a habitual connection that those foods lead to binging. The urges drive the binges. If you cannot respond to the urge, then that food no longer triggers the urge to binge anymore. It's just that basic deconditioning. Although, like I said, at the start, you still may have some heightened cravings surrounding these certain physiologically, quote unquote, triggering foods. Does that make sense? That was a lot.
Totally makes sense. And that's exactly what I do with my clients too. I have a philosophy that there should be no food that's off limits, because I think that when we create, and it really does come from dieting, we create these food rules and we also put morality behind food. We have good foods and we have bad foods, or this food's got a health halo and that one's the devil. And when we're dieting, what we're really kind of creating when we're restricting our cravings for these, more pleasurable or higher calorie foods. And so it is a big mind switch when you work with clients and you have them remove all of those labels and you help them to adopt a more neutral food mindset. But I have found that with my clients, once they have removed the restriction, the cravings are diminished.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something really psychological behind that, also physiological. When we are, consuming, especially like very highly processed food, we don't know, how they've been kind of tinkered with in the lab. And they are, they have people that they call craveability experts, food scientists who really work at making foods more addictive. So there is kind of this fine line when people are opening up foods. And what I actually found is like when people have gone to the go to highly processed foods as their binge foods, but then opened it up to being, say, that pizza was their go to thing. And they would always go to one of the big chains and get that kind of highly processed pizza. I've had them open up and try just pizza that they could make at home or that they go to a restaurant for and incorporate that into their diet in that kind of healthy kind of moderation way. And I've seen binging on those, especially those types of foods, reduce drastically as a result. So I'm in complete agreement that I think that completely avoiding the trigger foods actually may exacerbate the problem. And that
Yeah.
seems like it's worked for you as well. But like everybody, that these things are subjective and it may help a person more to avoid those foods. So it really is whatever works for you. That's the message we want to get out there, is that recovery isn't just a blanket formulaic method. It really depends on what works for you. So now I want to switch it up a little and talk about your podcast and your online course and how they offer additional support for those working to stop binge eating. How do these resources differ from your books, and what can listeners and participants expect to gain?
Yeah, good question as well. And Brain Over Binge was really my story. And there are insights in there, and there are ways that I break it down that someone can use and apply in their own life. But it really ultimately was my story. And then the Brain Over Binge Recovery Guide, I laid out ways that you can apply this in your own life. That's basically the self help version of Brain Over Binge. And after I wrote those two books, I still had people asking lots of questions and writing me all the time. And so I just kind of kept going. So the online course is a lot based on the Brain Over Binge recovery guide, but it's laid out in a much more structured way. It's for people who like audio. There's 130 plus audios in there to listen to. There's worksheets. It's just a way to go through everything in a structured way and to apply it in your own life. And then the coaching is there's one on one coaching to work through things like we just talked about, how to incorporate trigger foods, how to learn to eat enough. I mean, that's a huge part of my approach is learning to nourish your body. It doesn't have to be perfect. I call it, you need to learn to eat adequately. You don't have to eat perfectly, optimally. You just have to eat adequately. You have to nourish your body. So that's something that a lot of people who are stuck in cycles of binging and restricting need personalized help with. Also, give them personalized help in learning to not respond to these urges. I call it dismissing the urges, to have the urge to see it as something that's not you and to not follow that into the action of binging. So that's personalized help there. And then we have group coaching, which is for people who want that group support, who like to have daily encouragement, accountability, and just work through things with other people. And everyone's so different. Like you talked about using what works for you. So it's after I wrote Brain Over Binge, I just kept adding things that I thought would help people and all different types of people and all different types of situations. And as far as what someone would expect to gain from those additional resources, it is just more information, more insights. I have within those 130 audios, there's about 80 Q&As that are just basically any question I've ever been asked over the years, and I put them into recording. So it's really just more information and insights and strategies that are beyond the books.
I love that. And give me a picture of how you help people get into nourishing their body. What kind of tips do you have for people? Because I think when they're coming out of a restriction world, they don't tend to have a lot of awareness of their body's cues. they don't have an awareness of when they're actually hungry, when they're actually satisfied. What tips do you have for people?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those examples how everyone is different because there are some people who are so much into the dieting and binging and purging that they don't have any concept of when they're hungry, when they're full, what they should be eating. So for those people, it is very much more of a structured approach, having them learn to eat 3 meals, 3 snacks, eating at consistent times, developing, just giving their body the message that it's going to get fed consistently and getting it out of that survivor response. Now, some people come to me and they have a lot of experience learning to eat and learning to follow meal plans, and they do have a concept of being in touch with their hunger and fullness. And some people like that, like a more intuitive approach. They feel like any sort of structure feels a little bit more like dieting, and they like the freedom to eat when they want what they want. So it really is very individual, but I think overall, like you talked about in the beginning, we can't be putting ourselves in a calorie deficit and expect to recover. Like you said,
Mhm.
the way people diet today, it's just slashing calories, and that is going to perpetuate the survivor response. So it's really making sure there's enough food in quantity and also making sure there's some quality as well. I mean, really like to make sure people are getting those macronutrients and micronutrients. And I'm not a nutritionist, but I'd always refer people to a nutritionist if that they need that additional support there.
In your work with clients, do you work with people who've come out of eating disorder residential treatment?
I have for sure all types of therapies, and yes, residential, inpatient, partial inpatient, like outpatient. Yeah, like for sure. There's been a lot of variety of what people have come to me with. And a lot of times there's valuable things I've learned there and different ways of eating that have helped. And it's really about looking at each person and taking whatever has helped them in the past and figuring out how to tweak it to allow it to work all the way, I guess, and work completely and allow them to give up the habit. I mean, of course, the medical part of treatment, inpatient treatment, and things like that is so valuable. Some people really get themselves into medical danger as far as being underweight, not eating enough, purging is medically dangerous. So always making sure that people are getting the proper medical help they need. And a lot of times, those intense treatments are necessary to stabilize someone medically so that they can start to break the habit on their own. They can have that mental capacity then to work on recovery.
Do you ever work with clients that have had a negative reaction to inpatient or partial inpatient treatment?
Yeah, I mean, I've had people who go get like medically stabilized or go through that and then come out and fall back into the same patterns. So I think if you're not given the tools to understand the habit and understand how automatic it is and how the brain is going to respond once you get back out and face all your old cues and triggers and the things that make those urges come up, and you don't have a way to deal with that or you're not aware, it's very easy to fall back into the same patterns. So I have seen a lot of people who have gone into residential and then come out and start repeating the same patterns. But I think
Mhm.
if there's more awareness there, understanding the cues and being prepared, that it's possible to have that successful transition.
Yeah, I think I've seen a lot of people have difficulties with the kind of hyper structure that's
Mhm.
involved in treatment, the oversight, being followed to the bathroom, things like
Mm.
that are just very difficult for some people, especially if they're not doing any compensatory behavior. Find that really intrusive.
Yeah.
And I know that there's reasons for all of it. I know that there's very important methodology behind it, and it's all designed to keep the patient safe. But I think a big complaint that I've seen come out of that is they wish that it could be a little bit more customized to their actual disorder and individualized. And I think that's really hard when you're working in a clinic and insurance is involved and you've got to, you know, take people from beginning to end of their recovery process in the most efficient way possible. But I think eating disorder clinics, if there was any way to individualize it, I think a lot of people would come out of there a little less. I mean, I think some people are very traumatized when you introduce like a nutritional supplement to them. They're like,
Mhm.
"Oh no, I had that forced down my throat practically in the center. It's interesting to hear your perspective and clients' perspectives that come out of that and that come to work with you. Give me a little piece of advice that you would give to somebody who feels completely trapped in cycles of binging and feel like they've tried everything. What would you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you're never too far gone. It's never too late. It's always possible to turn this around. And if other people can do it, you can too. I think that's super important to see that there's absolutely nothing special about me as far as like how I was able to stop this. And I've seen so many people stop this behavior even after 10, 20, 30, even 40 years. Like that they can make that decision and they can and not it doesn't even have to be in one day. Like you don't have to stop right away. Like you can make gradual changes. It can be a process. You can be compassionate with yourself along the way. I think that self-compassion is super important. Like even if you feel like you've tried everything, there's one more thing to try. There's another insight just around the corner. There's another strategy you could bring in. I try to help people see that recovery is boiled down to two basic goals, which I've talked about here a bit. One is dismissing the urges to binge, and one is eating adequately. So it really helps it feel less overwhelming to someone who feels like, oh my gosh, I've tried everything under the sun. Well, if you break it down to the two simple goals, not always easy, of dismissing the urges to binge and eating adequately, it it just makes things feel a little less overwhelming because you can ask yourself, what's one thing I could do that would help me dismiss the urges to binge? What's one thing I could do to help myself eat adequately and make sure I have enough food and I'm out of that survival state? And if you frame it in that way, it makes you feel like you actually have a path instead of feeling so overwhelmed with a lot of the things that are told in conventional therapy about, okay, I need to solve my depression. I need to solve my self-esteem. I need to figure out my past. I need to figure out my relationships and solve all my triggers. And oh my gosh, it can feel so overwhelming. So if you
Mhm.
just tell yourself it's always possible to recover, and I just need to get a little better at both of these two goals every day, and then eventually you start seeing some positive change.
Absolutely. I think you're talking about a simple, fundamental mindset shift in
Mhm.
that when we look at diet culture, especially, diet culture is basically we're just inundated with these messages that we're not good enough, that there's something wrong with us, that we need this or that, or this diet or this product over here in order to be whole. And so a lot of people come into treatment with that mentality. And I think switching people's mindsets and understanding that's the problem, that it's not themselves that's the problem, is what they've been inundated with, is the first step in shifting that mindset. And I completely resonate with you in that once you get rid of that influence, then all you're left with is the body, is the mind, is what's going on inside. And the more we can tune in to the body, because the body, especially, the mind can be a little funky and not necessarily be our friends sometimes. But the body is always telling us the truth. And I think that is so valuable. We have been conditioned to ignore our body, ignore our hunger, ignore the signals from our bodies, and try to fit ourselves into this little square peg into a round hole. And when we actually tune into our body, when we listen to our hunger, we're actually befriending our body. And I think really reconditioning our thoughts in that hunger is actually good. That's why I get a little wary with these weight loss medications that just kind of remove the whole concept of hunger, because I think that once people actually tune into their hunger and they allow themselves food, then they tell their body that you're safe. They
Mhm.
tell your body that you are not in this danger zone. And when you're not in the danger zone, you go into a parasympathetic nervous system state. And if you can stay in that state when you're eating, and I like to, encourage people to eat mindfully, not in a distracted way, not in any kind of emotional, like over emotional state, but to really be present with their food and with their body then tells you when you're full, when you no longer need any more nutrition. And when that happens, your hormones stay balanced. Your body is in that state where it actually can incorporate and assimilate the nutrients. And that's actually when thermogenesis can actually happen, and your body just naturally goes to the weight that it's meant to be at. So give me a picture of some techniques that you might have for your clients that help them get in tune with their body.
Yeah. I love everything you said there because it's so right that once you get in tune with your body, then you can start to trust your body to regulate your weight on its own. It doesn't then feel like something you have to control, because when
Yeah,
we try to impose that control, a lot of times it makes us just more out of control. It heightens cravings, and once you can, yeah, develop that peace with your body, it opens your life up in so many ways.
totally.
So many of us that have been involved in this weight struggle, it makes your life smaller. So you're just obsessing of calories and pounds, and there's so much more. When you can just release that and allow your body to be what it is, it's so much freedom. And it doesn't mean giving up on health. It doesn't mean giving up on fitness. It doesn't mean giving up on feeling good. Some people
Right.
think, oh, you're saying to give up dieting. That means you're saying not to be healthy. No, quite the opposite. Like, giving up dieting is a very healthy change. So to respond to that, as far
Yes.
as like specific strategies, so like I said, I boiled down recovery into two basic goals of dismissing the urges and eating adequately. So within that framework, there are so many things that can help people better dismiss the urges and better eat adequately. So for dismissing the urges, they're not necessarily strategies, but there are 5 what I call components of dismissing the urges. And it's basically a mindset shift. It's learning to see the urges in a new way so that you can respond to them differently. Because no matter what strategies you give someone, if you're seeing the urges as something that's part of you, you need, that the binging is a symbolic way you're coping or whatever, all the strategies in the world aren't going to matter, because when that urge hits, you're going to feel like you need to follow it. You're going to feel like, this is me. This is what I need. This is what I want. So my components are more of a mindset shift and kind of review what we've been talking about. So the first component is to view the urges to binge as neurological junk. And that's a little term that just signifies that the urges are just that glitch in your brain. They're a automatic primitive response that's coming up that is meaningless, that's powerless, and that's harmless. It's just junk. It's not anything you need to consider any further. The second component is that you need to separate yourself from your urges to binge, or separate your higher brain from your urges to binge. And that's what I described when I said, I realized the urges weren't me. I realized that my identity, my self control functions, my rational thinking was in my higher brain, in the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that can control your motor movement, the part of your brain that can control, that just makes you who you are. So that,
Yes.
so realizing you're not the urges, that's the second component. Third component is to stop reacting to the urges. And it's impossible to control all our reactions, but it's about being as unemotional as possible about the urges and not letting them get you frustrated, upset, angry. Like, they're just there. They're not meant to hurt you. They're just that primitive survival response, and just trying to react to them less. And it goes back to what you said about the parasympathetic response, or the sympathetic response. When you're in that fight or flight, in that really sympathetic response, it's harder to access that higher brain. It's harder to access that self-control. So the less you react, the more you stay in that calm state where it's easier to act in ways that align with who you are. Fourth
Love it.
component is, the fourth component is to stop acting on the urges to binge. And that's pretty straightforward. But that's like the cure. I mean, that's how the brain changes. When you no longer follow those habitual pathways, those pathways change. It's the whole concept of neuroplasticity, which is a well-researched concept. What you no longer use in the brain, you lose. So not
Mm.
acting on the urges, it's really the cure, and that's made possible by viewing the urges in a new way. And then the fifth component is something you also said, and that's to celebrate success. Celebrate yourself when you don't act, because that also creates brain change. That solidifies a new habit, that helps you really just repeat the success by strengthening that self-control function. and celebrating like dismissing an urge and also celebrating like the benefits of not binging and all the things that open up in your life. Although they're not like specific strategies, those are the components that make up dismissing urges. And as far as eating adequately, there's so many different ways as far as eating adequately, there's many strategies people use, and it's a very individual thing, but it's all about eating enough quantity and eating quality food as well.
Absolutely. And I would add on just being present with your food. I really think that we have become conditioned to just not even think about the food we're eating because we're so scared of the calories and we're scared of this fat content and we're worried about this or that and is this healthy for me? And I don't think that serves us when we're eating. If we can just sit and be present with our food and appreciate it for its nutritional quantities and qualities, for the way that it looks, for how it feels in our mouth. When we actually slow down and we're present with it, we don't tend to shovel the food down. We don't tend to dissociate from it. We tend to be there with it. And when we're with it and we're in our senses, we're naturally in our body. We're naturally aware of how our tummy feels. We're naturally aware of how our mood is changing. And I think when you really practice it on a deep level, your body also is going to tell you what it wants to eat before you eat it. And I think that is so important to honor that and to not be afraid to say it's like, my body's, give me pasta. Don't be afraid of that. Your body's calling out for carbohydrates, specifically ones that might help energize you quickly. Act on it and see what happens. And I think when people really employ these techniques, they find joy in eating. And that's really, that to me is the ultimate goal, because I think eating is, and food is just such a wonderful pleasure. It is exactly what's keeping us alive. So we shouldn't be dissociated from it. We should be present with it. And I'm so glad that you and I really feel like we resonate on a lot of the same levels. And I am so grateful that you reached out to me and that we can do this podcast swap. I cannot wait to be on yours. And we're out of time for this one, unfortunately.
Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing. I appreciate all your great questions and your insights as well. And I'm very much looking forward to you being on my show.
Yay, I cannot wait. All right, everybody, please go out and buy Brain Over Binge. Oh, please tell everybody how they can get that and how they can work with you. What are all of your handles?
Yeah, I mean, Brain Over Binge is available on Amazon in audiobook and all the other formats, but you can find everything on brainoverbinge.com. That's where you can find my course. You can find the books there too. You can find coaching, one-on-one coaching, group coaching. So yeah, and the podcast is there as well, and the blog. So brainoverbinge.com is really the best place to find everything.
Yay, a one-stop shop. Please, everybody, go and read, listen to the podcast, get the recovery guide, everything, because Kathryn really knows what she's talking about. And we're really grateful that she's out there in the world helping people recover from binge eating, which is no small feat, but it is totally possible if you adopt the right mindset. So thank you so much for tuning into the ANEW Body Insight Podcast. We are looking forward to our next exciting interview, and we really hope you join us next time. Thanks, Kathryn.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning into the ANEW Body Insight Podcast. Please remember, the content shared on this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. You can find us anywhere podcasts are streaming, on YouTube at my.anew.insight and at anew-insight.com under the ANEW Body Insight Podcast tab. Follow us on our socials at my.anew.insight on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Threads for more updates. Tune in next time and evolve with us.